Welcome back to KMOX. Brad Young in with you this evening. And listen, COVID has been hard on all of us. And I did a little homework today, and I don't know if you know this, but dementia diseases were the 6th leading cause of American deaths during the COVID lockdown. And if you have a friend or a loved one who suffers from dementia and survived, you know how tough this lockdown has been on their quality of life. So to help us understand the issue of dementia and how it interacts with the COVID lockdown, I reached out to Brian Levy. He's with Cambridge Caregivers. Hey, Brian Levy, thanks for joining us this evening on KMOX.
You bet. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate your time. Let's talk about dementia-related deaths first, and then we're going to talk about something a little more cheery as we move on. But from that perspective, you know this statistic that during the lockdown, dementia-related diseases were the 6th leading cause of American deaths. I guess my initial question, Brian Levy, is this: how are dementia deaths and COVID lockdowns, how are those two things related?
It's a great question. I appreciate you asking. It all comes back to isolation. And when you have this elder community suffering from dementia, they need a lot of time and attention and love and face-to-face interaction. And all of a sudden, they're living in assisted living or independent living or with family members, and then all of a sudden they're cut off. And there's no longer that one-on-one care that they're accustomed to. And when there are caregivers with them, they have face masks on, so they don't even have a familiar face in front of them. And really, it just all comes back down to isolation.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, Brian, we think that with dementia or other conditions, if you're not improving, then maybe you're just going to be stagnant or just kind of holding steady. But what I'm hearing from you is that during this lockdown, because of the isolation, because of the inability to see friends and family and loved ones, because they were more often than not just locked in their rooms, it's not that they just stayed the same and didn't progress, but they actually regressed because of that isolation.
Yes, and I think that's a big misnomer is people really don't get better. It's not one of those. I had a resident. We have a boutique assisted living care homes called Manchester Care Homes, 4-to-1 ratio, very one-on-one attention. And I had a family member call me the other day, and he said, "My mom called me the other day from the house phone. I think she's getting better." It just doesn't work that way. That's not how the disease progresses. It progresses, and it takes different forms, if you will. But back to the issue, isolation is real. And when you have dementia and you're isolated from loved ones and caregivers and all of the attention needed for basic care, activities of daily living, it takes its toll.
Yeah, and because folks were locked, I mean, I had some friends of mine from my church who live in a senior care facility, and they would just call me and say they won't let us leave, because if we leave, then we can't come back in because there has to be a 14-day quarantine period. So not only were they isolated, but they were isolated inside of a facility. And of course, folks with that age, their immune system is less effective rather to fighting off viruses. So these folks just had it bad all the way around, both physically and psychologically.
It was absolutely the most imperfect storm. And I think one of the big takeaways from this entire year was how much adult children actually take care of their parents, whether they're independent living or assisted living. The adult children are going by daily, if not multiple times a day, watching their parents, dealing with caregivers, and really supplementing care. And then all of a sudden that was shut down, and no one is monitoring their health, their intake, their void, their anything. They just don't have the attention that they need to live a healthy life.
Yeah, my mother-in-law is 94 and still lives in her home. But because she wasn't in a facility, my wife could go and still help take care of her almost on a daily basis. But had she been, in a senior care facility and not been able to leave, that proves the point that you're talking about, Brian, that she couldn't have been there to help her. And of course, we're talking to Brian Levy. He's with Cambridge Caregivers. So let's move on from that aspect, Brian, and talk about how COVID affected those who survived but still struggle with dementia-related diseases. So for those folks who obviously and thankfully didn't pass away, those folks have regressed. Now, because of the new interaction with family and friends and employees, are these folks going to be able to stabilize their condition, or is it going to continue to regress because of what happened during COVID?
Well, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. But I will tell you this. I will tell you this. I know for a fact that our residents and even our Cambridge Caregivers clients are showing signs of let's say they're thriving more with the family interaction. There's just a whole new outlook and just a completely different feel that they're having. Just the mere touch of an adult child holding their mom's hand or touching dad's arm and talking to them, not through FaceTime, but live in person. It has a tremendous impact. It's real.
What are some of the things, Brian, and of course you're with Cambridge Caregivers, but what are some of the things that you do at Cambridge Caregivers to interact with folks in the memory care unit to give them that intellectual stimulation that helps to, bring back at least portions of their former selves? What kind of activities do you do to stimulate them intellectually?
So we work with the families to better understand what was mom and dad like before they fell ill. Before they were affected with this disease, did they tap dance? Did they fence? Did they golf? Did they box? Those are some real examples of clients' hobbies. But
boxing, why? That would be fun.
I have a very, very senior SVP of a Fortune 100 company that did all four of those things. But it's interesting to, when they have dementia, to integrate those things back into their lives. Now, I'm not saying that we have this gentleman fencing, but we'll find a way to get a book, get a movie, watch it on TV. If we have a resident who traveled to Africa quite often, and so we integrate animals into her activities through books or the History Channel or other mediums. We have activities where we will study. For instance, study penguins or fish on Tuesdays and get excited for the Thursday field trip to the aquarium. So they have something to look forward to, and they're still engaged, where they're not just sitting in front of a TV watching The Price is Right.
Yeah, if I were working there and the gentleman who was the fencing expert asked me for a book, you can be absolutely certain I would get it for him instantly if he's a fencing expert.
No doubt. In boxing. Yeah.
In boxing. We're talking to Brian Levy with Cambridge Caregivers. And Brian, my daughter works in the memory care unit of a senior living facility in Minneapolis. And she told me something that echoed what you said a few moments ago. And that is, during the COVID lockdown, when staff were wearing masks, it was a real problem because it interfered with the residents' ability to recognize their caregivers that otherwise they knew quite well. And she pointed out that it was not just the physical part of the mask that was a problem for the residents, but also because the mask muffled their voices, and it made it very difficult for folks who may have hearing loss already, because then they couldn't look at their lips, they couldn't read their lips, and it made it difficult both from a cognitive and a physical recognition perspective because of those masks. Did you find that to be the case? And if so, are things better now that, for the most part, masks are lifted for those who are vaccinated?
It's a double-edged sword. The masks definitely take away from helping communicate with residents and even not just reading lips, but a simple smile. Facial expressions are really important in interacting with the elder community, especially when they have dementia. That said, we were just in a meeting this week talking about when are we going to be able to loosen the policy of masks for staff and family members coming to visit. And I got to tell you, it's not going to be anytime soon. We are extra cautious. Knock on wood, our care homes have been COVID-free for going on, 16 months. And, the masks and washing of hands and educating the staff really made a difference. And we're not ready to take any undue risks right now. So masks are here to stay for a little while. Not hand sanitizer, but actual soap and water.
Yes.
And true education from our medical staff to the caregivers.
Well, we're talking with Brian Levy of Cambridge Caregivers. And Brian, if listeners want more information about Cambridge Caregivers, either for resident purposes or maybe even for employment purposes, how can they find you?
I appreciate you asking. Simple, manchesterliving.com. There's links to Cambridge Caregivers, to Manchester Care Homes, our CNA school, and our podcast. And we are hiring, so I appreciate you mentioning that. If anybody's looking for a job, we would love to entertain and look at resumes.
Absolutely. Brian Levy with Cambridge Caregivers. Hey, thanks for joining us this evening on KMOX.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.